Over on Jaguar Gatorade, a new college football video is out. In this video, we talk about a dumb business decision made by Wisconsin during the 1981 season. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. I'm going to give you a hypothetical scenario. Suppose you have 4 wide receivers on your active roster. Already, that's a pretty low number of receivers, since most teams carry 5 or even 6 onto the active roster on Sundays. But let's say you do have 4 guys playing that position. All of a sudden, one of those 4 receivers gets hurt. It's an injury that's going to keep that player out for next week's game, meaning that right now, you've got 3 wide receivers going into your next game. What do you think most general managers and teams would do in this situation? You guessed it, they would sign another receiver. They'd find another receiver as an extra body, so that the other receivers can rotate in and out and stay fresh, and so that you can play certain looks if the situation calls for it, such as if it's 4th and long and you've got to go for it. In other words, you'd be stupid to just, not sign someone that can play the position and fill the void. It limits you tremendously. It puts a ridiculous burden from a stamina and an energy perspective on your current players, and it just makes you look incompetent. But no team will be dumb enough to do that, right? Well, allow me to introduce you to the 1988 Minnesota Vikings. Because from the same general manager that was dumb enough to trade away literally an entire dynasty worth of draft picks for a running back, I present to you this piece of idiocy that you might not be too familiar with. In 1988, the Minnesota Vikings were traveling down to Miami to take on the Dolphins. Well before the game, it was known that one of the Vikings' defensive linemen would not be able to play. And General Manager Mike Lynn just decided not to do anything about it, which led to incredibly predictable results that should have come as a surprise to no one with a brain. Because this is the story behind some of the stupidest roster management in the over 60-year history of the Minnesota Vikings franchise. Before I talk about the actual decision in question, or should I say, the lack of a decision, we need some context to understand why the Vikings were in this predicament in the first place, as well as the game at hand that they were about to play. And to do this, we have to talk about the previous game that the Vikings played, which came on September 25th, coming in Week 4 of the 1988 season against the Philadelphia Eagles. The Vikings won this game by a final score of 23-21, winning it on a game-winning field goal with 15 seconds left. And a big reason why they won this game and prevailed and came out on top was because of the play of their defense. Minnesota ended this game with one of the best defenses in the entire NFL. Through their first 4 games, they only allowed 47 points, which comes out to an average of less than 12 points per game, was the best total in the NFC, and was the second best total in the NFL, only 3 points behind the New York Jets. And this game against the Eagles, even though the score might seem a bit on the higher end, was no exception. They held Philly to just 12 first downs, forced 4 turnovers, held the Eagles to a completion percentage of just over 54%, and completely controlled the defensive line in just about every facet. When it came to the ground game, Philly had just 70 rushing yards on 24 carries, averaging a mere 2.9 yards per carry. Keith Byars, who got the most carries this game for the Eagles, was usually a guy who was an absolute menace whenever he got the ball in his hands. But against the Vikings, he did nothing, being held to just 21 yards on 12 carries, which comes out to an average of 1.75 yards per carry. And keep in mind that one of his runs went for 13 yards. So if you take out his longest run, you're looking at a guy that had just 8 rushing yards on 11 carries, averaging less than a yard per carry. But not only did the Vikings dominate on the defensive line in the running game, but they dominated in the passing game as well. Because of the 31 passing plays that the Eagles called with Randall Cunningham, he got sacked on 8 of them, meaning that more than a quarter of Philly's passing plays ended with Cunningham getting knocked down in the backfield for a sack. Minnesota's defensive line was absolutely feasting to start the season off, and considering some of the names on that line, it's not hard to see why. Every single starter on the defensive line for the Vikings that day would finish their career as a player who made it to the Pro Bowl multiple times. with the 4 starters being eventual 2-time Pro Bowler Henry Thomas, eventual 8-time Pro Bowler and Hall of Famer Chris Dolman, eventual 2-time Pro Bowler and 1989 Defensive Player of the Year Keith Millard, and 3-time Pro Bowler and former Defensive Rookie of the Year Al Baker. So that was the good news. The Vikings had a great defense and a great defensive line, and they were riding high after this win against the Eagles, which was their 3rd straight win, and took them to 3-1 at the quarter mark of the season. The bad news? Well, we have to talk about this play for a second. On this play, which was the first play of the second quarter, Randall Cunningham got sacked, with defensive tackle Keith Millard and linebacker Jesse Solomon providing the hit. Don't worry, the referees didn't call roughing the passer on the play, because who knows what that even means anymore. However, after the play, you see Eagles tackle Ron Heller rolling around on the ground in pain, struggling to get to his feet. Seems odd, seeing as he was totally fine on the play. But when you watch what happened after the play, yeah, it's not hard to see why he was in pain. Because after the play, for no reason whatsoever, Al Baker just decides to poke Ron Heller in the eye. Now, I'm not going to dive into the specifics of this play, because that's a topic for another video. Because this play was so ugly and so outside the scope of the game that in January of 1990, 15 months after the incident, Heller actually sued Baker for the poke. It should be noted that Heller suffered permanent eye damage and had to go to the hospital. And Baker's defense was that not only was the poke unintentional, but that Heller contributed to the poke by having the audacity to walk into Baker's hand, which is odd, seeing as Heller was completely standing still. However, all of that aside, the play was so dirty and so egregiously foul that the NFL decided to suspend Baker for a game, with league spokesman Joe Brown saying that the play constituted flagrant unsportsmanlike conduct. And this meant that going into their next game against the Miami Dolphins in Week 5, the Vikings were down to 6 defensive linemen. Heck, even 6 might be calling it a stretch, because one of them was Doug Martin, who missed training camp in the first 3 games of the regular season while dealing with some contract issues, and was very clearly not in game shape, which isn't surprising when you have a guy who missed all of training camp. Right now, the Vikings, who run a 4-3 defense, so that puts a heavy emphasis on the defensive line, had just 6 defensive linemen who were eligible to play, and one of them was not even in game shape. Obviously, that's not ideal, but this shouldn't be a huge problem, right? Just sign a guy off the street so you can have a solid number of defensive linemen like you usually do. This will allow you to rotate guys in and out, since most defensive linemen can't play on every single play without losing 1,000 steps or being physically exhausted, gives you insurance in case someone does get hurt or gets ejected, and allows you to keep playing the looks and packages that you have been playing all season that have been working so well. You could sign a guy that just got cut by another team. You could sign a guy that you had in the preseason that's still in game shape and knows the system and the playbook. You could sign literally anyone who could play defensive line. So with the Vikings desperately needing bodies, who do the Vikings decide to get to fill the void left behind by Al Baker's suspension? Let's ask Keith Sweat. Okay, let's ask Alicia Keys. Okay, let's ask Howard Jones. Yep, they signed literally no one. They decided that it would be a great idea, in the wake of Al Baker's suspension, to just sign no one, meaning that they were going to go down to Miami with 6 defensive linemen. And if that's not bad enough, this is Miami in early October that we're talking about, where it's still super hot, and where the weather will absolutely play a factor if you know anything about how Florida works. It's going to be humid, and it's going to be in the mid-80s. One report said that during the game, it got as high as 87 degrees, increasing from what the temperature was at kickoff at 83 degrees. When you combine that 87 degree heat with a relative humidity of 76%, that means you're dealing with a heat index temperature where it feels like 101 degrees. You realize how insanely hot that is, right? And now, you're asking the Vikings to play the entire game in that brutal heat with 6 defensive linemen total, one of whom wasn't even in game shape. Imagine if you were outside during a blizzard somewhere up north, and you're in a light jacket and shorts, which already isn't providing a lot of protection. And then, your jacket breaks, and you just decide not to replace it. Seems stupid, right? Well, that's what the Vikings were going to attempt to do here. In this absolutely big interconference game, since the Vikings needed to win this one to keep pace with the Bears for first place in the division, and since the 1-3 Dolphins were looking like one of the worst teams in football through the first quarter of the season, the Vikings decided that they were going to try this one shorthanded. How did all of that work out for them? Well, as you've probably been able to tell by the highlights, not well at all. Because this game was ugly with a capital U, as when the final whistle sounded, it was the Dolphins who came out on top by a final score of 24-7. In reality, it wasn't even that close, as midway through the fourth quarter, the Dolphins were leading at 24-0, up by 4 possessions since the 2-point conversion did not exist back then. And sure, there were many reasons as to why the Vikings lost this game in a somewhat surprising upset, including the ineffectiveness of their running game, as their leading rusher was Allen Rice, who had just 20 yards, the fact that they couldn't hold on to the ball, as they turned it over 4 times, and the fact that starting quarterback Tommy Kramer put up an absolute stinker, going 13 for 33 with 220 yards passing, no touchdowns, 4 interceptions, and a passer rating of 23.1, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. He got benched later on for Rich Gannon. But guess what unit struggled big time and contributed heavily to the loss? Go ahead, guess. You're never going to believe it. That's right, it was the completely gassed, completely wiped out, completely exhausted defensive line, who had to play practically the entire game with no rotations or substitutions because of some absolutely incompetent roster management. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that this was going to be the outcome? The defensive line, which had 8 sacks last week, and who was going up against an offensive line that allowed 4 sacks the previous week to the Indianapolis Colts, had none this week, in the game that started one of the most remarkable streaks in NFL history that will never be broken, as from the start of this game until the middle of 1989, Dan Marino would go 759 straight passing attempts without a sack. If you want to learn more about that streak, which lasted over a year, click the card in the upper right corner. And after the game, sure enough, all of the defensive linemen talked about how tired they were out there, and how that contributed to the loss and the poor performance. As defensive tackle Keith Millard said on the 101-degree heat index, the heat was bad. It affected me in the first half. I was really fighting it. Every third play, I felt exhausted. The best news of the day was when the sun went down. Defensive end Doug Martin echoed those thoughts, saying, "I think we psyched ourselves out from the heat. And when they got up on us, the coaches and players panicked a little bit." Translation from both of these comments, it was way too hot to play as much as we did today. And it's not too hard to see why the players felt this way. The Vikings were optimistic that this could be an addition by subtraction moment, and instead, it turned out to be subtraction by no addition whatsoever. So what's the moral of the story here? If you're a team and you're already paper thin in a position, do something. Literally do anything. Add any player that can play the position just so that you have options and can give your guys a chance to breathe. Especially if you're playing in the hottest environment in the entire league, where you know that heat and fatigue are going to be major issues. Because when there's an issue, and it's entirely foreseeable and entirely within your control, and you do nothing whatsoever to address the issue, don't be surprised when your completely fatigued defensive line can't defend against anything whatsoever. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9. To see college football videos, subscribe to JaguarGator8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.